begin. Good evening, everyone, and I do thank you all for joining our shiur tonight. We're going to have an opportunity to study the 3 weeks, Bein, ha-Metzarim. That's what we call the 3 weeks. And it's a time that we commemorate challenging times for our nation. But as good Torah Jews, we really have to plug into the time. In other words, be mindful of the period, experience and be mindful of the tragedies we are commemorating. And also Judaism always believes in the fact that you never focus on something that's negative unless you could learn from it and make it into something positive, right? We don't focus on tragic events and just say, the world sucks, this is terrible. But rather, we allow ourselves to feel that pain. We're mindful of those difficulties that either people are going through now or historically went through. But then we are a faith that's very constructive, and we ask ourselves, okay, what can I do now? In what way can I make the world better? How can I have a positive impact? And clearly the 3 weeks is a period of time that we remember the tsaros of Klal Yisrael, the difficulties, the tragedies. It culminates with Tisha B'Av, which is a day of commemoration, of focus, of growth, of learning. But it has to come with an attitude that we're going to utilize it. And even these difficult times, there's a level of happiness because we have an understanding that we have guidance, we have a direction, we know what existence is about. We know why we go through this absurdity called life, right? If we wouldn't have that guidance, it would be completely absurd. But due to the fact that we have that guidance, we have the tools to deal with challenges, and there are so many tsaros out there and difficulties, but we're given the book, we're given the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's how we manage through these periods of time. So that's what we're going to focus on a little bit as we're going to talk about the 3 weeks, the Bein ha-Metzarim, and due to the fact that it is more of a shiur, so with your permission, I'm going to present the text in front of you. So we're going to learn from some text and different ideas. But as mentioned, I would like to thank Elita Wigoda, Shina Kazum. They are sponsoring to commemorate the yahrzeit of Chava Bat Binyamin, and we're going to learn some Torah for Schus of the Neshama. Now, the 3 weeks, which begin on Sunday, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, on the 17th of Tammuz, and end with Tisha B'Av, are known as the Bein ha-Metzarim. Why are they known, or why are they called the Bein ha-Metzarim? There's a verse in Eicha, Kol Rodfea Hisigua, Bein ha-Metzarim. All her pursuers overtook her between the straits. So obviously it's describing people trying to escape, trying to get away, but they go through a narrow straits and they're caught, they're trapped there. But tradition has been for many, many centuries that these Metzarim, these straits, relate to difficult periods of time. The first one, the 17th of Tammuz. There are tragedies that, as we're going to see soon, they are recorded in the Mishnah, tragedies that befell our ancestors, an indication that it is a day that unfortunately carries within it challenge. The other day of difficulty is obviously Tisha B'Av. So the period of time, these 3 weeks in between, are known as the Bein ha-Metzarim. We are between the straits. Now, as we're going to analyze this period of time, we're going to realize that we have a little bit of a challenge of finding clear halachic guidance regarding what is unacceptable for the first part of the 3 weeks. In other words, We all know, we have learned that Mishenichnas Av Mima'atin Besimcha. When we enter into the month of Av, this is already appearing in the Talmud, that's when we minimize our happiness. So that seems to indicate that we start acting in some ways as mourners, or perhaps limit happiness. That indicates that that begins Rosh Chodesh Av. On the other hand, we all know that there are things that we don't do during the 3 weeks, which already places a beginning to this period of time 12 days earlier. So that's where we're going to go ahead and try to understand the period of time up until Rosh Chodesh Av. And beforehand, I would like to share with you a thought that's mystical. And obviously, I do not have the ability to explain to the fullest extent mystical concepts because it's beyond me. It's not my school. Nevertheless, when there's something that I read in some Hasidic or mystical text, and I believe that I could take something from it, even if I do not have a full appreciation of the message, I feel comfortable that I could share it. So that's what we're going to do now as a starter to start our discussion. So I'm going to share with you an insight from Reb Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin, a great 19th century thinker. And he points out something very interesting. You know that we in Shul, every Shabbos have a Torah reading, and then we have a Haftorah. And the Haftorah is always linked to the parasha. The Haftorah comes from the prophets. We read words of the prophets. It appears that there was a time when we did not have access or the ability to read words from the Torah itself. So therefore it was instituted that we read from the prophets, from the Nevi'im. So even though we, thank God, have the ability to read from the Torah, again, we read words from the prophets, but we know that there is a connection between that which we read in the parasha to that which we read in the Haftorah. And it is a nice thing to try to do at a Shabbos table. Perhaps you could find it in Torah IQ, which is a book that's becoming popular now, that you try to find the link. In what way is the Parsha connected to the Haftorah? Now, this Shabbat, right, this Shabbat, tomorrow night, Shabbat morning, is the last week when really there is a clear connection between the two. Because the last 10 weeks of the year, we have special haftoros where the goal is not so much to connect to the parsha, but there's a very different goal there. So tomorrow's the last one of the connecting haftoros, and after that we have 10 weeks where there is not necessarily a connection, but we are trying to achieve something else. What are those 10 haftoros? So it's divided into 3 and 7. The first 3 are known as the 3 haftarot of Poranuta, Tlat, which is in Aramaic 3, of Poranut, of tragedies. The 3 haftoros where we hear the words of the prophets, of Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu, telling us, be careful, because if you don't do what you're supposed to do, there's going to be some serious consequences. The nation of Israel is going to face a very significant challenge and tragedy. So those are the 3 haftarot that are unfortunately poranut, a warning for the negative. After that, we have the recovery period of Sheva de Nechemta. We have the 7 haftarot where we are given nechama, we're given comfort. Sheva de Nechemta. Now, Reb Tzadok HaKohen, a great thinker, shares with us that the reason we end the year with 10 haftaros, 3 of them, we could call them negative, 7 extremely positive, because the last 7 are words of comfort. Nechama, the Almighty and the prophets are comforting the people of Israel. So he shares with us that there's a rule The rule is, in Aramaic, Bereisha chashucha v'hadar nehura. Existence for righteous people is that things start off when it's dark, when it's painful, but eventually they merit nehura, they merit light. And as we all know, you could only appreciate things if there's a contrast, right? When you go through a period of time when you're overwhelmed and it's over, you say, thank God, I could return to normal. When one day we could enter into a store and we don't have to wait in line and we don't have to wear a mask, or we could come to shul, or you could go to a restaurant, or you could even travel. We're going to say to the Almighty, Baruch Hashem, you're going to be full of appreciation. Why? Because after a year and a half, and who knows, a little bit more perhaps, of this awful pandemic, we'll be appreciative, because when you start off with darkness, you really feel the lights. And therefore, says Rav Tzadok HaKohen the following, that you should know, and this is where he enters into mysticism here, that when we talk about the Almighty's relationship to the world, we talk about attributes. In other words, God is merciful. Now, God is also mighty. God is the essence of truth. He's the essence of glory. He's the essence of eternity. He's the foundation of all, and he is the king. Now, I mentioned there are 7 attributes, and there are 7 individuals that lived their lives by that attribute, and they somehow brought down to the world these attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They are known as the Sfirot. Okay, in mystical terminology, it's a Sfirah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is one of Chesed, Gvura, mightiness, Tiferet, right? Beauty, or a better one would be something that's glorified. Hod, right? External beauty. Eternity. He's also the Yesod. So these are concepts which, again, are mystical. But what's interesting is that even though we say that there are these 7 attributes, in other sources, there's an indication that there's 10. What are the 3 additional ones? So they're known as Chokhmah, Binah, and Dat in mystical terms. And they form the crown of the Almighty. So again, this is not an area that I want to focus on. But what I do get from it is the following, that he writes, says Reb Tzadok, Shlosha rishonot hem kochot hamachshava. In other words, the 3 attributes, right? Chokhmah, Binah, and Da'at, which is wisdom, understanding, and making it all come together in life, and that in complete understanding. Those things have to do with the mindfulness. The 7, on the other hand, is our actions. And what I'm reading from it is the following. We live a life of action. We action, right? We do things. We wake up in the morning. We do a lot of things. Our mindfulness is extremely important to be successful with our actions. In other words, if I have mindfulness and I have appreciation for the fact that I'm living, appreciation for the fact that I'm living a life of meaning. So the 7 things symbolizing the things I do in the physical world suddenly are extremely holy and important and meaningful and beautiful. If on the other end, I'm lacking mindfulness and I act like a robot, unfortunately, the 7 becomes mundane and you are no different than any other walking creature on the planet. So the 3 has to do with machshava. And therefore, since we are supposed to live a life of appreciation, and the 7, which symbolizes our physical actions, have to be imbued with appreciation and happiness, the only way we achieve it is by being mindful of the 3 of tragedy, because then we could contrast and say, you know what? I'm living my life. I'm going. I'm able to walk. I'm able to do things. When I have mindfulness and I understand that it's not a given that everything works the way it should, the mindfulness of the negative makes the positive good. And therefore, the 3, which is negative, is something to be mindful of to appreciate the 7. That's it for mysticism, okay? But let's first learn some practical laws. And let's start off with what is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz about? So the Mishnah tells us, Chamisha dvarim iru et avoteinu b'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. There are 5 things that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. So let's be mindful of it on Sunday. If you are fasting or if you're not supposed to fast, nevertheless, it is a day of recognizing the significance of the day. So let's go through it. Number 1 on the list is Nishtabru Haluchot. Moshe Rabbeinu comes down the mountain. He sees a nation that should have been prepared to receive the handwork of the Creator, the tablets, but instead, unfortunately, they're worshiping the golden calf. A tragic day. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz was the date. Also, Batel HaTamid, 2 ways to understand it. One is that there was, throughout the years of the temple, a daily sacrifice. And the nation understood that when we are consistent with that sacrifice, we feel a connection to the Creator. And when we feel that connection, we have a protection from Him as well. Unfortunately, 3 weeks before the destruction of the Second Temple, it ceased. They were no longer able to offer it. That's the tragedy we commemorate. There are those that say that the Batel HaTamid, that there was a stop for these offerings that were brought daily, is referring to a different period of time, and that was during a civil war that occurred 100 years before the destruction of the temple. Now, number 3 of the list, on the list of what happened on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Huvke'ah ha'ir, the city was breached. Okay? Number 4, there was an awful king among the Greeks. His name was Apustomus, and he burned the Torah. Number 5 on the list, He'emit Selem Behechal. There was a pagan image that was placed in the temple. Some say it was this Apustomus himself who was mentioned earlier, and others say that it was the king Menashe. Now comes the question. We want to know practically, what do we stop doing from Shiva Asar B'Tammuz? Yes, there are many things we're going to learn as we get closer to the 9 days, but what about Shiva Asar B'Tammuz? So number 1, and it's not the best way to present it because chronologically this should be towards the end, but I'm going to start with it because there's less of a focus on it. Says Rabbi Avram Gombiner in the 17th century that you should know, it appears to me, asur la'asot rikudim umecholot. We should not have dances from the 17th of Tammuz and on. So communal dancing, right? Not acceptable. And as a result, the custom is not to play music that could lead you to such dancing. So to go ahead and put on music which leads you to rikudim and mecholot is avoided from Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Some have a tradition to avoid all music, and there are those who even avoid recorded music. Now, it's very hard to say that there's a halacha that you avoid recorded music when recorded music did not exist in the days that these decrees were made. But I can tell you from myself, the way I relate to these days more than anything else is perhaps that when I get into the car and I want to put on some classical music, and I know, you know what, it's the 3 weeks, I'm not going to do it. So that is my way of connecting to this period of time. And I think for many as well, they don't listen even to recorded music. Not that it's a prohibition. Many people, for example, like moving on to a cappella during this period of time. But that's my way of relating to this period of time. Now, also the tradition is no haircuts. Fine, not going to focus on that a lot. And anyway, well, truth is I've been asked because they are opening some haircuts here in Ontario next week. But let's get into something, an interesting discussion here. We're going to study text. So let's try to put this together. Says Rabbi Yosef Karo. So Rabbi Yosef Karo here is going to be in the black. And he tells us, Ein nosim nashim. Now, this statement that we are reading now from the Shulchan Aruch, from Rabbi Yosef Karo, is talking about the 9 days from Rosh, Chodesh, Av, and on. And he tells us that from Rosh Chodesh Av until after Tisha B'Av, en osim nashim, no weddings, ve'en osim su'udat erusin. Even if it's only a young woman that was betrothed, it was when historically they separated the two segments of the wedding, and the first part was known as erusin. That too should not be done from Rosh Chodesh Av, says Rav Yosef Karo, but to get engaged, clearly to get engaged, or the historical erusin belos su'uda mutar. So that's what Rabbi Yosef Karo comes. Now, as you all know, for Ashkenazim, you have to tune in to what the Ramah tells us. Ramah tells us, you should know, we have a custom. V'nohagim lehachmir, Ashkenazim have a custom. She'en nosim meyudzayin betamuz ve'elach. Ashkenazim do not perform weddings from the 17th of Tammuz and on, until after Tisha B'Av, ad achar Tisha B'Av. So while the Sephardi authority, Rabbi Yosef Karo, makes it very clear that after Shiva Asar B'Tammuz until Rosh Chodesh, there is no issue at all with performing a wedding, the Ashkenazim are machmir, okay? Keep that in mind, Ashkenazi versus the Sephardi practice, because we're going to focus on it the second half of the class. Now, in Shulchan Aruch, and this is regarding the 9 days, Rabbi Yosef Karo shares with us 3 practices, 3 traditions regarding the tradition of not eating meat and not drinking wine. What are the 3 traditions that he shares? Number 1, says Rav Yosef Karo, Yesh nagin shelo lechol basar v'shelo lishtot yain b'Shabbat zu. Practice tradition number 1 was that during the week of Tisha B'Av, no meat and no wine. Practice number 2, there are those who avoid meat and wine only from Rosh Chodesh ad Ta'anit. Practice number 2 would be what? That you avoid meat and wine from Rosh Chodesh. Practice number 3, Yesh mosifin miyudzayin betamuz. And there are those that say that already from Shiva Asar Betamuz, no meat and no wine. Did you hear that? That there are those who are of the opinion that from Shiva Asar Betamuz, starting next Sunday, for 3 weeks, excluding Shabbos, no fleishiks and no wine. There was such a practice. Now, I think we all know that our practice is to follow that which is mentioned in the middle, that it's from Rosh Chodesh until the Ta'anit. But now comes the Ramah, and the Ramah tells us the following, that you should know, Ubisudat mitzvah, if you are participating in a Suda that's a mitzvah. And the examples presented are Bris Milah. Number 2, Pidyon HaBen. Number 3, which is the only one which we could manage to schedule, Siyum HaSechet. For some of us who are doing the Daf Yomi of Yuma, Yuma ends right before the 9 days. So if you take a little bit longer to complete it, you could have a Siyum, a Fleishik Siyum, a Meat Siyum on Tractate Yuma if you finish the Daf Yomi. So he's presenting, the Ramah here is presenting examples of Sudas Mitzvah. And the next Sudas Mitzvah, which he's mentioning that you could have meat, is Seudas Erusin, an engagement party. And he tells us regarding all of the above, Ochlim Basar V'Shotim Yain, you could eat meat, you could drink wine, but you can't invite the whole city. It has to be people that have a relationship to the event. Kol HaShayachim LaSeuda. I remember 27 years ago, it was the second day of Av, and we were celebrating, Miriam and I were celebrating the bris of our Bechor, of Uzi. And at the time, we weren't really financially able to make a whole fleishik meal, even though we could have. So we had a traditional milchik bris in the morning. So a friend of mine from Chicago called and he wished me a mazel tov, and he says that he wants to drive in with my uncle, but he said he has one t'nai, one stipulation. He's gonna only come in if there's a fleishik meal, meaning he's not driving all the way from Chicago for some bagels and lox and cream cheese. He wanted fleishiks. So we had one section, one table. We had some fleishiks for those who came in. So while everyone else was eating milchiks, they were eating fleishiks. Okay. Now, there's a question that my Zaidi asked me many years ago, and he asked a very basic question. I probably heard it even before Zaidi asked me the question. And Zaidi wondered, wait a second, we just read the Ramah where we are told that an example of a meal that you could have fleishiks is a seudat erusin, right? One of the examples presented here as a festive meal is a seudat erusin, and you could have fleishiks. But the problem is that Shulchan Aruch earlier told us, en osim seudat erusin, you don't make one at all, meaning even milchiks is unacceptable. So this is a major problem. How do you understand what the Ramah is telling us? That one of those celebrations which would be acceptable to have meat is a seudat erusin, an engagement meal, when that itself is prohibited. So Zaidi said that he once heard an answer that in earlier editions of the Ramah, it did not say seudat erusin, but rather only had the letters samach and aleph. Okay. Now, when it was originally written, what the Ramah was telling us was the following: that if it's a seudas mitzvah, like a bris milah or pidyon haben, or if you complete a tractate or sforim acherim, siyum masechet, and the samach aleph meant sfarim acherim, other books. However, someone deciphered it wrong and looked at the samach aleph, Zaidi said, and said that samach aleph stands for seidos erusin, and that's the source for the mistake. So it's a nice pshetel that my Zaidi said. It's not correct because even in the earliest editions of the Ramah, it says seudas erusin. But I'll give you my answer, which I think is the correct answer. And that is, as we learned earlier, there were communities that would not eat fleishiks already from Shiva Sarbatamuz. Now, even though they didn't eat fleishiks, they would nevertheless have a meal of seudas erusin. Regarding such a community, the Ramah tells us that they can have fleishiks. Okay, that's the answer I give. One more detail before we get into what I call the interesting discussion, which I'm always inspired by, is the fact that Shulchan Aruch tells us, Tov lehi zaher, it is appropriate to be careful and avoid saying shechianu during Bein ha-Metzarim. You try not to make a shechianu. That's why we don't purchase new suits that require a shechianu. So new garments, if it's an undershirt, you could buy until Rosh Chodesh Av, there's no issue. But anything that would require a shechianu, you avoid. And so too, if there's a new fruit, right, you try to delay enjoying it until after Tisha B'Av. However, the Ramah says that if it's a pri shelo yimtza achar Tisha B'Av, if it is a fruit that will not be available after Tisha B'Av, meaning it has a short season, then mutar levarech ve'leochlo ben ha-Metzarim. I remember when I was a child, 9 or 10 years old, maybe even 11, we got some new clothes, and it appears that I wore it for the first time on a Shabbos. It was during the 3 weeks. And I remember my grandfather, Malevsky, Olav Shalom, saying something as if, 3 weeks. And my father responded, well, Shabbos, it's okay. And as a result, there are those that follow that tradition that although you avoid a shechianu during the 3 weeks, Shabbos is permissible. So if there's a magnificent fruit, or if for whatever reason a person can delay wearing a new suit, if there's some kind of event, or you have nothing else to wear, Shabbos, you could be lenient regarding the shechianu. Okay, now, the brief discussion we're going to have now for the next few minutes is one that I really enjoy. And it relates to what we discussed earlier, that the Ramah tells us, Ein nosim miyudzayin betamuz ve'elach. I think we all know that we do not perform weddings from Shivos or Betamuzan. That is the Ashkenazi tradition based on the Ramah. Okay, that's what we talk about now. I'm going to show you now a political bumper sticker from Eretz Yisrael. Okay, do you see this bumper sticker? Okay, now, what do you see on this bumper sticker? So number one, you see a political party called Shas, which I believe that we all have heard of this party. It came into existence in 1984 as a national party. It existed more within local politics from a few years before, but as a national party, it came into existence in 1984. It had a spiritual leader for many decades, Rab Ovadia Yosef, and it became a force in Israeli politics, a very significant one. Their motto and their campaign slogan was Lehachzir Atara Leyoshna. Literally, that's translated as to return the crown to its old glory. Meaning there was a crown that has been lost. This political party is going to be returning the crown to its old glory. What is it referring to? And this is no minor, no, this is more than a bumper sticker. These for many, many decades, if you would see a poster of Shas, obviously you have Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and on, you're going to always find the words La'achzir atara leyoshna. What is it all about? What is it all about, La'achzir atara leyoshna? So if anyone knows a little bit about the history of the state of Israel, you know very well that the country was controlled by labor, by Mapai, for the first few decades of the country. And unfortunately, they had many flawed attitudes, to put it lightly a little bit. They had a very negative attitude towards religion, and they even had more of a negative outlook towards the Edot HaMizrach, the Sfaradim. And many of these Sfaradim who came to the land of Israel, and some of them with great enthusiasm and excitement to return to the land that was given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the period of Israel, unfortunately encountered a secular country with an agenda to uproot their faith, uproot their traditions. There are stories of cruelty that even for those of us who are very proud of the Jewish state, we have no way of ignoring those dark periods and awful stains to our record as a nation. Terrible things were done by the secular leaders of labor. The mistreatment of Sephardim was cruel, What was done to the Yemenites and what was done as well to others is something that we don't talk about it too much. We try to focus on the positive, but it existed. The Sephardim were mistreated, by the way, not just by the secular, but even within religious circles, unfortunately, the attitude was to look down at their traditions and to look down at them. And they were always viewed as secondary. They did not have their own powerful yeshivot as the Ashkenazim did. So when they would join such yeshivot, they in some ways were viewed by some, not by all, as second-class citizens. And Sephardi pride was lacking. And when a group does not feel pride in their own heritage, they decline. And many of the tragedies of the early years of the state, and they still live on, are the byproduct of that attitude. But then there was someone that brought back their pride. And therefore, in some ways, he's my hero as well. Because if someone brought pride to members of my nation, I'm a big fan of such a person. And that is Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was recognized already in the 40s as a tremendous scholar. He gained popularity in the 50s. And even though he was much younger than other Sephardi rabbis in the 60s, he was already considered a leader due to the fact that he had a phenomenal memory, that what nowadays we need a computer, right, to use for a search, the only computer that existed for Talmudic and halachic literature was the mind of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And when he writes his responsa, he could quote 30 sources and give you the precise location one after the other in a way that's not natural. And he brought back Sephardi pride. And his motto was that you should know that in Eretz Yisrael, if you would visit Eretz Yisrael in the 16th century, Jews in Eretz Yisrael followed Rabbi Yosef Karo. We, the Sfaradim, the Edot HaMizrach, had the crown. Unfortunately, the crown was lost with these Ashkenazim that moved in that don't respect us. But I'm going to start a movement, Lehachzir Atara Liyoshna. I'm going to start this movement to return the crown of glory back to the olden days, to the ones who deserve it. And if there is one area in halacha where you really find Rabbi Ovadia Yosef dictating that, you know what, I don't care about what the Ashkenazim say, I'm doing it the Sephardi way, this issue regarding weddings after Shivas or B'Tammuz, before Rosh Chodesh Av, where Rabbi Yosef Karo gave a green light, the Sephardi authority said, fine. The Ramo says the Ashkenazim don't. Here we're going to have the issue where we're going to find Rabbi Ovadia Yosef making a statement. So what I have in front of you is a tshuva of Rabbi Ovadia, not every detail, but some of them. It's more than I usually post, but it's an important one. It makes me happy to read it. Because Jewish unity is not everyone doing the same, by the way. When during the 3 weeks we focus on Achdus, Achdus is not everyone doing it the same. Achdus is everyone doing it the way they're supposed to do and respecting it. That when you see a Jew that does a little things a little bit different than you do, or in some cases a lot, you respect it. In this case, I want you to be proud of him. My goal is that over the next few minutes, as we study the words of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, you take pride. Even if you're not a Sfaradi, take pride in the fact that Klal Yisrael had a person that said, I'm doing it my way. And this is my hero for the day. So he shares with us the following. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef tells us, Bebo'i shanazu l'sharet b'kodesh be'ir ve'em b'Yisrael Tel Aviv. In other words, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in the 1960s. I don't remember the exact year, if it was 63, 64. I don't remember, but he became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. So he becomes the Sephardi chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, a very significant position. Tradition was in Tel Aviv that the rabbinate, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, did not register and did not allow any weddings during the 3 weeks, because that's the Ashkenazi tradition. And that was accepted. It was accepted on the norm until Rabbi Ovadia Yosef becomes chief rabbi, because we are told, Horeti, I gave a psak, b'siyata deshmaya, l'rabbanim, I told the rabbis, roshmei anisuin, those that are in charge of registering and performing weddings in the Rabbanut of Tel Aviv Yafo, leharshot lasot, I gave a green light, nisuin l'sfaradim, for Sfaradim and Edot HaMizrach, gam lachar yudzayin betamuz ad Rosh Chodesh Av, I gave a green light, and I told them from now on, for Sfaradim, we're doing it the Sephardi way. Now, even though up until then the Sephardim were following, for the sake of unity perhaps, following the Ashkenazi practice, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, nope, we're doing it our way. Kedat Maran, because we're going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Shekibalnu hore otav, because we the Sfaradim have accepted his traditions. And he notes that even though that until now lo nahagu lirshom lenisuim b'mei ha-Metzarim gam lesfaradim etot ha-Mizrach, even though tradition was up until now not to allow it, tziviti, I commanded, shemikan velaba, that from now on yinagu lakel, they should be lenient. And he goes through the opinions which we studied already. Now, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is an honest posek. And if there were some Sfaradim who actually believed that it is appropriate to follow the Ashkenazi practice, he's going to share it with us. Meaning he's not going to rewrite history. He's an honest posek. But he's going to nevertheless take his opinion. So the first Sephardi authority, which seems to agree that even Sfaradim should follow the Ashkenazi practice of not celebrating weddings after Shivasar B'Tammuz, was a rabbi. His name was Reb Chaim ben Venesti, who wrote the Knesset Agdolah. And he writes that he lived in Izmir, if I'm not mistaken, he lived in Turkey. And he writes that we have the tradition of not having weddings, okay? So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef tells us, and I'm not going to read every detail, that you should know that that was done by the Reb Chaim ben Venesti only as a chumrah during the 17th century, because they had a very serious crisis in the second half of the 17th century. There was a group of people that were nullifying all the fast days. And all the laws of mourning that we practice were thrown out the window. Why? Ki bezmanon nimshachu rabim acharei shabtai tzvi. They were following the false Messiah. This was a mass movement. Unfortunately, many Torah scholars believed in him as well. A charismatic false Messiah became quite destructive eventually. But part of that movement was the fact that they believed that fast days are no longer relevant. And therefore, to combat that movement, Reb Chaim ben Venesti in Turkey believed that we have to be more machmir, and therefore not to allow any weddings from the 17th of Tammuz. So what he's saying is that yes, there was a Sephardi opinion to be strict like the Ramah, not allow weddings from Shivasar B'Tammuz, but that had a very special reason. Now, then he notes that the great Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, big name for Iraqi Jewry and Persian Jewry, this Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad was considered a very significant authority. And he tells us, says Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, that they too did not have weddings from Shivasar B'Tammuz. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, okay, maybe that was in Baghdad, but in Israel we don't have to follow it. And then he notes, Shamati, I heard, from the current chief rabbi of Babylonian Jewry. It was a rabbi by the name of Salman Huji Abudi. Salman Huji Abudi. I heard the name as a child. This rabbi, his name was Rabbi Salman Huji Abudi, who lived in Eretz Yisrael. He was originally from Iraq, arrived in 1951, didn't bother sharing with any of the secular officials that he's a chief rabbi. So they sent him to one of the kibbutzim, actually, in 1951, to plant trees. He was a modest person, and he said, okay, if they want me to plant trees, I'll plant trees. Until people around him realized that this is absurd. He's a chief rabbi of Iraqi Jewry. He shouldn't be planting trees. Now, I heard of Rab Salman Huji Abudi because my father got smicha from him. Now, if you wonder why my father, Olav Hashem, got smicha from Salman Huji Abudi, so my father, Olav Hashem, had a good friend, Rab Simcha Parsons, who lives in Milwaukee. Some of you know, I think, the name Simcha Parsons, like David does. And for entertainment, what they did was when they were in the Mir in the early 1960s, when they had extra time for entertainment, they would go. So today you go touring. They would go for smichas, meaning they would go into great rabbis, knock on their door, talk to them in learning, and then ask for a smicha. So that was their entertainment in the early 1960s. So Simcha Parsons and Zayn Gesund and my father Hacham went to many of them. Among them, they went to Salman Huji Abudi. And they got smicha. I had it. I think maybe I gave it to one of my brothers, or maybe I still have it somewhere here. The smicha of Rab Huji Abudi. They went to Rav Nisim. They went to Smucha. They went to many, many, many different rabbis. My father told me a funny story that one of the rabbis they visited, after talking to them, they said to the rabbi, "Can you give a smicha?" So it was an older rabbi, and the rabbi said, "You know what? You guys write up something. I'll just sign it." So my father wrote something, but Simcha Parsons, who has a great sense of humor, wrote La Rav Hagoyin Isha Ishkolas. He gave a tremendous amount of titles to himself, and he gave it to the senior rabbi who signed it. So that was the entertainment that yeshiva boys would have in 1961, 1962, Eretz Yisrael. So Huji Abudi I heard about it as a child. And what's relevant for us is that Huji Abudi was a rabbi in Baghdad. And Rabbi Ovadia Yosef asked him, what was the minhag in Baghdad? And Huji Abudi tells Rabbi Ovadia Yosef that you should know, Haminaga pashut haya la'asot nisuin ad Rosh Chodesh Av. Even in Baghdad, where Rabbi Yosef Chaim, the great Rabbi Yosef Chaim, who died in 1909, said not to perform weddings, they were. Sfardim are allowed to perform weddings. That's what he was told. So therefore, bottom line is, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, I'm giving a green light. I am telling the Sfardim to do it. Now he notes, Shamati, I've heard, Sheyesh to'anim, there are those that claim, al dvarai, there are those that disagree with me. There are those that claim, how can you come to Tel Aviv in the mid-1960s? After having a practice since probably 1909, not having weddings in Tel Aviv, how can you, young rabbi, have the chutzpah to change a minhag? So therefore he notes, I heard people say, Sheme'achar she'arabanim harishanim leTel Aviv, since the great chief rabbis of Tel Aviv Yafo, Shekidmuni, who predated me, Hinichu minhag lachmir, since great rabbis that predated me, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, left the minhag as the Ashkenazim not to perform weddings, how can I change a minhag? En l'shanot minhag. So he says, Lav milta here. Rabbi Ovadia says that's not an issue. Why? And here he shares with us the fact. Yadua, it is well known. Sheharabanim harashiim asfaradim shekadmuni. All Sephardi chief rabbis that predate me, says Rabbi Ovadia, they were, in Talmudic language, have mikaf kaifi lamiteihem. They were subservient and secondary and kafuf. They were as if bent down to honor the Ashkenazim. They were considered less significant. And he gives us the details and the facts, how historically Sephardi chief rabbis had no choice but to accept Ashkenazi authority. And he spells out examples, like Rav Ben Zion Uziel had no choice but to listen to Rav Kook. And he shares with us a story that this Rav Uziel, who focused so much on unity, was willing to push aside Sephardi practices, even regarding Shechita. But for Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, that's not the way they do it. And he goes through a list, by the way. There was a chief rabbi a chief rabbi Toledano in Tel Aviv. He had no choice, and he couldn't say anything against Rav Unterman. Meaning, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is sharing with us that historically, Sephardi chief rabbis had no choice but to follow the Ashkenazi practice. So therefore, the Ashkenazi were memunim v'sholtim. That seems to be the key to understand that period of time. The Ashkenazim took control. They did not give the Sephardim the ability to plug in and to be part of their heritage. And they controlled the Rabbanim. Vehinigu hakol keminhag bnei Ashkenaz. They did everything like the Ashkenazim. And if you wonder why the Sfaradim didn't open their mouth, why did they not protest? Why did they not have a movement, Sephardi Lives Matter? So he says, Lema'an hashalom shatku. For the sake of peace, the Sephardim were quiet. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef claims, and he proves it, you cannot claim minhag when you are forced to do something, right? If I spent 6 weeks in someone's house, and they're not feeding me any milchiks until I wait 7 hours after a fleishik meal. You can't say it's a minig if it was forced upon me. It's not a minig. And therefore, says Rav Ovadia Yosef, since what the Sephardim were doing and were not performing weddings was forced upon them by the Ashkenazim, b'kahai gavna, in such a matter, vadai lo chashiv minhag. It's not considered a minhag. But Rabbi Ovadia says now things are different. Anan, but we, meaning talking about himself, de lo kafinan. I'm not subservient. I'm not secondary. I'm not kafuf. I'm not going to bend over for anyone. Toda LaHashem Yitbarach. He's grateful for the Almighty that he is recognized as a scholar greater than the Ashkenazim he interacted with. Says Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, al mishmarti amod. I'm going to stand on my guard. What is my guard? What's my mission? What do I want to do? Listen to these words he writes here. Lehachzir atara liyoshna. My goal is to return the glorious crown to the olden days, to the past. If it's a Sephardi practice, I'm going to let Sephardim do it. And therefore, if you want to be machmir, you're a chet rabim nasa. In other words, to delay weddings is not a good thing. Yado ala tachtonai has the lower hand. This is what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef does. He takes a position. And therefore, as a result, when you want to understand the Shas movement in Israel, and you want to understand, by the way, also their lack of trust of government. If you remember, some 20-something years ago, Ari Yederi went to jail, and there were hundreds of thousands of people who believed he's innocent. I don't know the facts, but what I do know is the lack of trust towards the state from the Sfaradim there is due to the fact that they were mistreated. It's a fact, unfortunately. And the credit goes to this great Talmid Hacham who returned the crown to the past. The Sfaradim suddenly had pride due to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And that's the essence of a movement. And for me, as I enter into a period of time, the 3 weeks, and yes, I mourn, my achdus is to celebrate those who stick to their traditions and fight for it in a peaceful way. In a peaceful way. That for me is a celebration. And that's the type of achdus I want, that people stick to their traditions, are very proud of their traditions, live by them. And that's, I think, what we could learn. So it's an important halacha we were able to understand. We had the opportunity to review a few things of the 9 days as well, and hopefully learn a little bit. So we thank again our sponsors, and we thank everyone for joining us. And it's an opportunity to wish everyone a good evening as well.